Hello and welcome to Right Hive 2023. This is how LGBTQ plus rep has changed fiction. And I have three wonderful panelists with me today. I'm Adria Bailton. I am your moderator for today's panel. With me today is Esme Symes-Smith. After cutting their teeth on a steady diet of fan fiction in the southwest of England, Esme Symes-Smith wandered north to Wales for their degree in literature and creative writing, then promptly migrated to Missouri after meeting their wife on Tumblr. Esme has been a ghostwriter, an editor, a frozen yogurt seller, and a caffeine purveyor. They now wrangle preschoolers for a living and have a severe tea problem. Also with me today is Christen Randall. Christen Randall, she, they, is a queer, fat, neurodiverse author of queer, fat, neurodiverse books. When they're not writing joyful stories for the next generation of geeky gay kids, you can find them working at their local library branch or at home planning all the D&D campaigns they'll run one day, they swear. Christen lives in Covington, Kentucky. The No Girlfriend Rule, Athenaeum Spring 2024, is her debut novel. And finally, I have Lara Ameen. Lara Ameen is a screenwriter, novelist, short fiction writer, sensitivity, authenticity reader, and PhD candidate in education with a disability studies emphasis at Chapman University. She received an MFA in screenwriting from California State University, Northridge, and her scripts have placed in Screencraft Sci-Fi and Fantasy Screenwriting Competition, Launchpad TV Pilot Competition, Austin Film Festival Screenplay Competition, and others. Her YA contemporary fantasy novel, Spear, was awarded a Disabled Writers Grant from Suffering the Silence, longlisted in Voyage's YA First Chapters Contest, and their Book Pitch Contest. A Lambda Literary Screenwriting Fellow, Mentorship Matters TV Writing Program finalist, and an NBC Launch TV Writing Program finalist, her short fiction has been published in Prismatica Magazine, Disabled Voices Anthology, Flash Fiction Magazine, Drunk Monkeys, Just Femme and Dandy, and elsewhere. She makes her traditional publishing debut as a contributor to the young adult multi-genre anthology Being Ace, forthcoming from Page Street on October 10th, 2023. Welcome all of you.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, glad to be here.
Okay. And with me today is Kalynn Bayron. Kalynn Bayron is the New York Times and indie bestselling author of the YA fantasy novels Cinderella is Dead and This Poison Heart. Her latest works include the YA fantasy This Wicked Fate and the middle grade paranormal adventure The Vanquishers. She is a CILIP Carnegie Medal nominee, a 3-time Civils Award nominee, a Locus Award finalist, and the recipient of the 2022 Randall Keenan Award for Black LGBTQ fiction. She is a classically trained vocalist and musical theater enthusiast. When she's not writing, you can find her watching scary movies and spending her time with her family. Welcome, Kalynn.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. All right, well then we will jump in with our first question, which is, what is the history of LGBTQ representation in fiction?
Yeah, so, how far back do we want to go? There is a long history of queer rep in fiction, but, we can take it all the way back to, Plato, to Homer, Shakespeare, moving forward a little bit, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf. 20th century kind of brings us this new wave of queer literature, and not all fiction, but also deeply influential on fiction writers. The work of Audre Lorde, Anne Allen Shockley, off the top of my head, Octavia Butler, Mind of My Mind, Wild Seed. Those are all, all of these things are hugely influential and really, really show how vast and varied our history is. And we've always been here. we've always been in this space, creating these works.
Well, queer representation has been in fiction forever, right? Like literally since ancient times.
It has. And I often feel like, you know, even though the representation is there, I think a lot of, you know, scholars and historical folks like to pretend it's not. So like, even though, you know, queer folks have existed for, you know, thousands and thousands and timeless years, it's really easy to pretend that we didn't.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it's kind of like any marginalized identity, right? It's always going to be something that gets erased, or the way like the stereotypes or the way different things are is going to be portrayed in a certain way that might be harmful, and then people see that and they'll be like, oh, that's what queer fiction is, and it's not, but that's what we see all the time. So like even queer people internalize it because that's what's shown on in media, in books and in TV and film, is like the same tired stereotypes, and like, because that's part of the history, is seeing, you know, like not just good representation but also the bad. I mean that's, there's a lot of like, you know, in between, but I think that there's like, there's not a lot of room. There can not be a lot of room for nuance. There can be and there can't be.
And I you know, I think it's really rough because, you know, people see themselves in books or they don't see themselves in books. And I feel like maybe historical folks had a better time of it than we did now, because, you know, there's less stigma, less, you know, willingness to erase those identities. Whereas, you know, the Western world got to the 50s and then they're like, no, there is no diversity anywhere. Whereas Shakespeare is like, yes, everyone is queer. It's fabulous. It's really interesting to feel like, you know, in the modern day, we are behind the times. And, you know, folks from 300 years ago were more, you know, modern than we were.
That segues really nicely into my next question, which is, how is LGBTQ plus representation different today versus in the past? And specifically, how have maybe tropes changed? What tropes have been problematic in the past? Have they gotten better? Are there tropes that were maybe not problematic in the past, but now we've come into new ones?
I don't know, as a queer kidlit author, I write middle grade fantasy. I feel like I always existed like in between the lines, in the subtext. That's why I love fan fiction. You know, I feel like that's why so many queer folks, you know, go to fan fiction to discover themselves and find themselves and like read about themselves, because, you know, we'll see two characters on screen or we'll read about two characters in a book, and we'll feel something that's so familiar, even if it's not said out loud, that we'll take it and we'll run. Whereas today it's like, we can be the main character, and how cool is that? I feel like the most amazing moment of my 20s was watching She-Ra, and
Yes.
no, it wasn't She-Ra, it was Korra, yeah, the Avatar one. And my wife and I were sitting side by side on the settee. We were just like, haha, gay, because, you know, that's what we do. We find sometimes haha, gay. And then suddenly they're kissing on screen, and I'm just like, excuse me, what? Hey, it's wild. And then suddenly, like, we didn't know what to do with ourselves, because we didn't have to imagine anymore. We didn't have to work hard for that, you know, representation. It was just right there. So what are we going to do with all this extra energy? It was wild to me. And honestly, just seeing that on the page, especially in Kidlit, is just so empowering. Especially like reading middle grade stories, even in my 20s and my 30s, it really speaks to like my inner child who struggled to understand themselves, you know, because like I didn't know who I was, I didn't have the words for myself, and now suddenly there's this whole like language that I didn't know just for me, and it's fabulous.
Absolutely. I had literally, in my little nerdy notes that I took, literally less subtext, more direct representation now. Because definitely, like, I grew up in the age of like, in fandoms, like, ooh, I think there could be a little bit of gay going on here, and then you jump on to like AO3 or like fanfic.net, and like that's where you go to town. And now you can like read stories with wonderful varied queer rep in so many different genres and so many different age categories. You can go into any bookstore and grab a book off the shelf or the library. So I think that it has definitely become more upfront. We don't have to just like, it's not like a fringe, oh, like this character could be gay. Like, you get your own story now. Like you said, you get to be the main character, which is wonderful and fantastic. There's also, I think, something that I've really enjoyed lately in YA particularly, that's the age category I'm writing in. It's just, there's so much going on, like there's so many different kinds of representation across like different identities, and so many wonderful joyful stories, so many wonderful messy stories. It's not just relying on a lot of the like bad old tropes like bury your gays or like a traumatic outing. There's just a lot more nuance. There's a lot just more like regular contemporary stories with main characters who happen to be queer, and that's just something really cool and rad about them. So I think that it's just, there's a lot of wonderful stuff going on very upfront, centering queer life now.
Yeah, I've also been a fanfic writer, and I didn't really, I still write it because I have to. But I'm mostly in like the disability rep, more than like queer rep, but I know that now, because I had discovered things about myself, like I know that I want my characters to be both like disabled and queer, or other identities too, whether I'm finding it about myself or like side characters and stuff like that. But I think in terms of representation, I don't read a lot of middle grade, but I think in YA there has been a gigantic boom of all different types of queer YA, whether it's lesbian, bisexual. There's a lot more trans stories by trans authors, even in the last 5 years or 3 to 5 years, than there was even like 10 years ago. I think in terms of like queer identities as a whole, not like two specific identities, but in terms of like grouping them all together, there's just a lot more queer YA. And I think it's starting to be also in adult, because I write both YA and adult more than I don't really write like middle grade or anything, but I've noticed that especially like in YA, I'd like to see it more in adult too, but there's just a lot more room for, like Christen was saying, there's different types of stories. Like you're not just gonna get the same like cis, white, lesbian or bisexual. You're gonna get like a ton of different, ethnicities, backgrounds. You might get like a disabled and queer character, a disabled queer Black character, or something like that. And I think because more people are writing like their own stories, I think that kind of pushes back against the problematic tropes that already are there, and they're saying, hey, here's what's problematic, so I'm gonna do my own telling. And like that's why there's so many retellings and so many like those different kinds of stories, is because there are so many marginalized people who haven't had a chance to be a hero in their stories. So like if there is a queer retelling of a certain kind of story, no, it hasn't been done before because it hasn't been done in that way. So it pushes back against like the problematic tropes that exist.
And I think it's really important to like think about the way that we used to have so many harmful tropes in queer fiction, and then I feel like we went all the way to the other side where it's just like kind of toxic positivity. Like you have to be a happy queer, a healthy queer, and it's just like I don't know any happy healthy queer, so that doesn't speak to me. But I feel like in recent years, especially honestly the last few years, there's been so much more space for queer characters to show like the whole spectrum of like being a human being. You can be a messy disaster and still be, you know, the main character. You can still be a hero. You could have a redemption arc without like coming out the other side shining, which I feel is really important. You know, you can have a gay person who makes mistakes, a gay person who's like has prejudices, and you know, queer people who speak up against that, and also like don't know how to feel about their own identity. I think it's so exciting now to, you know, pick up a queer book and be like, I don't know what the story is going to be. Because like, I feel like before you'd pick up a book and it'd be just like, yes, this is going to be a coming out book. This is going to be like an angsty book. But now it's just like, I don't know what it's going to be, because, you know, this queer character has as much chance to be anyone as any other character. And, you know, I love that. I love that so much. You know, my shelves are full of like all the different kinds of queers. Like I have Hell Followed With Us, which is my favorite of all time. And just like the messy anger and the power in that, I feel like is so important right now, especially as, you know, queer folks are being really like persecuted. I feel like it's important more than ever to show that anger and that rage in like a main character kind of way. Like main characters don't have to be necessarily good, which, you know, I really enjoy that.
Did you say that Hell Followed With Us?
Yes.
Okay. That also, your summary also made me think of Iron Widow.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Very messy.
And The Witch King by H.E. Edgman too. It's amazing.
All winners, absolutely. I think with the idea of having to have this like perfect gay in queer writing, now that we're seeing, especially in like YA and especially in kid lit in general, middle grade has some wonderful titles as well. It takes a lot of pressure off authors. Like when I'm writing, I feel like I can portray queer life as it is, and I think it has the added benefit of taking a lot of pressures off of readers, especially younger readers who are reading and seeing like, oh, I don't have to have everything figured out, I don't have to be perfect all the time, I can make mistakes, I can be sloppy, and I can learn from all of that. And I think that's a really important quality of LGBTQ lit where it is right now and where it's growing, because that's so important to have out there as, you know, just something that readers have access to.
Yeah, I think especially for kids, right? Because you don't want them to be like, oh, there's only one way to perform queerness or to be queer or something. And like that, I would think that would make young kids, I mean, I don't know, because I'm not the young kid anymore, but I would think that would make someone who's figuring out their identity at a young age very uncomfortable. Like, oh, I have to have this figured out in this way. Whereas if they see a book that has like queer representation that's messy, or, you know, queer representation about grief, or queer representation about, you know, different things, I think that, you know, young kids will say, oh, like these experiences that I'm going through are, this is the norm, because there's no one way to you know, to perform the identity of queerness. Or
yeah, and like honestly, that's why I write, and that's specifically why I write middle grade. Like not even necessarily in like a queer context, but like, you know, I remember being a kid and feeling very messy and reading my favorite books, and always like the villains would be like the bitter ones, the ones that cannot forgive, the ones that have been wronged and, you know, hold grudges, whereas like the heroes always like these perfect shiny people who come out happy and healthy at the end. And I'm just like, I don't see myself in the heroes. That must mean I'm a villain, you know? And I feel like it's so important for kids to not just get the queer representation and the other diversity, but like, you know that it's okay not to be okay, you know? And I feel like that's such an easy thing to say. It's such a cliche thing to say, but it's so true, especially, you know, when you're 12 or 13, like really, you know, in the middle of all those like horrible hormones, you know, and being at school and like seeing books and just like picking up a book and seeing yourself on the pages is such an enormously empowering thing. Like I feel like, you know, cis het white people don't necessarily know what it feels like to suddenly have that representation that they haven't had before. And you know, I'm so excited to be a part of giving that to other kids.
So I think really that all of this work is in conversation together. Queer representation in fiction has changed because we're kind of building, we're building on the work that has come before. So I think that we kind of learn to grow and change. And what we're getting now are many, many, many different kinds of stories that are across different genres and age categories. And we're getting these stories from queer authors. And so it changes the way that the storytelling is done. Very often when we're talking about tropes, especially when it comes to queer representation, bury your gaze, that kind of thing, it's because we get stories that are told from non-queer perspectives. And so there's a very narrow view of what it means to be queer and exist as a queer person. But I think that that narrow view of what it means to be queer from the point of view of someone who is not a queer author, you kind of get characters that are progressive enough to include, but not really important enough to flesh out in any meaningful way. And so that is where the problem kind of comes in. But I also think that when tropes, I love tropes because they are storytelling devices. I don't think there's anything wrong with them, but I think they take on a completely different meaning when they're done by queer writers, because it means something different to us. Queer people die in some of my stories, but it's not bury your gaze, because that the queer person that dies isn't the only queer person that exists in this story. And I'm not burying my gaze. I just happen to, have a cast full of queer people. And so I think that we kind of need to be cognizant of that and how some of those tropes began and what they mean for us as queer creators.
So we covered a bunch of tropes and we talked about a bunch of different books. How do these portrayals change across mediums? Or maybe they don't.
I don't know. I read this question and I was racking my brains to think about it, because I know in my heart that they do. I'm just really struggling to put it into words. Honestly, I feel like visual media has the ability to be a lot braver than written media does right now, at least, especially in like the middle grade sort of category. Like I'm thinking of the middle grade books we have, and then I'm thinking about shows like The Owl House. And I feel like, especially now, whilst books are being banned and being taken off shelves and blah blah blah, blah I feel like it's much easier to pull books down, and kids are getting in trouble for having a book, than it is to like have something on the television. I feel like TV has always been able to be much more progressive than books, maybe in its accessibility, I'm not sure. But I've definitely seen a lot more courage, especially for the executives, like taking those chances. I've been very lucky with my editor and my publisher, because they let me do what I need to do with my series, which is fabulous. But I know that's not universal, especially in Kidlit, because there is so much risk putting money into something that might explode. Feels like making a bomb sometimes.
In some ways I kind of feel the opposite, but then I don't write, like that middle grade age range. But I kind of feel, because I'm also a screenwriter and not produced or anything, still nothing like that. But I in doing, and being having written so many scripts and then coming into writing fiction and doing both simultaneously, I kind of feel like there has been, like, I saw more queer rep in book, I mean, at least in YA, than on like TV. But then there are some really good queer portrayals, especially when they are played by queer actors. One that came to mind that I really enjoyed was the TV series Special, which starred Ryan O'Connell, and he is a gay man with cerebral palsy, and he's also a novelist. He wrote a book called Just by Looking at Him, and he adapted his, I mean, he he wrote this memoir called Special, and that was adapted into a show. But he also wrote this novel. But there is queer rep like that, like queer and disability rep, or other kinds of queer rep. I'll try to think of something before this panel ends, but like I've seen, like especially with TV, I think TV more than movies, because a movie is very like, you just sit for 2 hours and it's done. TV, you have a chance to watch the characters grow over a certain amount of episodes, and that's kind of like a book where you see a character's journey, and that might be a character coming into their queerness, or figuring out something maybe about their friend who is queer or something. And I do think in some ways I think TV is braver than books, but in some ways I think it could be the other way. I just think it depends on what the story is. But I think we still have a long way to go, because or else you're just going to get a bunch of like white cis, like, or like one type of queerness, and TV and film and books are going to say, oh, it's just this type of queerness, and not like, they're not going to give someone a chance to explore like that there is literally a rainbow of identities. So I think it just depends on I think it depends on the medium, and it depends on what you're looking for too, like flipping through Netflix or whatever.
Yeah, I think I'm really thinking about genre fiction as well, because I know there's like a fantastic scope of like contemporary queer fiction, like across the board of age categories. But I need more magic. I need more science fiction. I need more, send the queers into space. Not in a bad way. So
yeah, I agree with that for sure. Like, I think in contemporary YA space, especially, like, there's just been this huge boom. There's a wealth of wonderful stories. There's even more coming. A space that I've noticed that has some really interesting queer rep lately is graphic novels, really across age genres, but especially in middle grade and YA. There's just so much, like, there's so many different, yes, love that one. Or like Sea Dragon Society is wonderful too. Like, there's so many wonderful just like casual queer rep books out there in middle grade, and just like in kid-lit graphic novels in general. And I have just been devouring them just as a reader, because they're so much fun and so wonderful and so just completely different in the stories they're telling. So I think that's really neat. I think we should get more of like, queers in space, like just like bring it on.
Yeah, I feel like the queer graphic novels really just like paved the way for the rest of us. And like,
absolutely,
reading The Prince of the Dressmaker was like the initial inspiration for my Sir Callie books. I'm just like, yes, I want to absorb this feeling and send it back into the world. I feel that with Owl House too.
Yes, also very, very good.
Yeah, I was just thinking, there's been a lot of queer rep on the TV I've been watching lately. Like, Ted Lasso just had basically their last episode kind of dedicated. Sorry, spoilers.
Just want to caught up.
Yellow Jackets has had queer rep since the beginning. I mean, that's a very dark horror show. So, but it's nice that you can have them that, like you were saying, it can be messy. We're in this terrible situation, right? Like, but this is their life. So, in terms of TV.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what Lara said too. I really liked your likening the journey in the book to a TV series, where you have like the space and the time to really, appreciate the wholeness of queerness. And it feels weird to talk about Ted Lasso on a fiction panel, but like I really love the way that they do queerness in that show, because you do have that spectrum of like, oh, messy drama, but also like super casual and also healthy, and also like, this queer breakup is exactly just like a straight breakup. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but it can be, but it doesn't need to be. And I feel like having that space to really let characters live is so important.
Sense8 did a really, really good job with queer rep and in the, sci-fi-ish space as well, in terms of having, the diversity of relationships and stuff like that. I really enjoyed that, and it was so refreshing to find that kind of queer relationship in a genre show. I was like, oh my gosh, and they like did it so well, and it was so good, and then it was canceled.
No.
The constant struggle with queer media, right?
I think we all just need to be very happy that Schitt's Creek didn't get canceled prematurely, because boy, howdy, does that make me cry every time. And like, honestly, I feel like Schitt's Creek was so unique in the moment because just the experience of watching it and waiting for David and Patrick to like have this huge like drama for everything to be terrible, and like it wasn't, and it was so like safe but not in a patronizing way. I remember the episode where like Patrick had to come out to his parents, and my wife and I were just sitting there going like, oh god, oh god, like it's just like it feels so familiar and bad, and then for it just to be, it's okay, you were worried but you don't need to be, we accept you. It's just like this rush of relief. Oh, Schitt's Creek, blessings.
So good. It's such a good show. I still haven't watched like the last season, but
it'll destroy you. It's so good.
I've been wanting to, and then I just never finished. But I just remember like when I had first watched it a couple of years ago, and hearing the word pansexual on television, I was just like, that doesn't happen. And just the way the relationship was portrayed, and with David and Patrick, and just how the family was so accepting, and it being in a comedy was really cool. And it was really cool to like the way it was explained. It wasn't like so in your face that it was like obnoxious, but it was done in a way that was like, I think can make more people understand and be more accepting. And then people were writing articles about like how they felt that it was accepting, for them and to their families. And that I thought was cool. Because we were seeing like other stuff that was like outside of the show, people responding to it, and that I thought was really cool. And I was like, oh, that's kind of like the equivalent of like an author, getting like, a book review or something like that. And like that was really cool to be able to watch. See?
And just to have like a queer couple in a comedy who aren't the joke. Like wow, it literally blew my mind. Not literally, because I have brains all over the wall. Anyway, but like, they were never the butt of the joke. And I feel like David was such a great window into the viewer, because like he was just so anxious about it the whole time. And I feel like he felt the way that we felt, just expecting just the chaos and the drama and the awfulness of just like, the fear of being a queer person in the world. I felt like he really embodied that. And then just to have him taken care of so well. Oh, my feelings. I love it.
I also really like this show, Everything's Gonna Be Okay.
Oh, I haven't watched it yet, but I want to.
It was on Freeform and Hulu, and there's two autistic characters who are queer, and they end up in a relationship, and they talk about, being asexual and being autistic and what that's like and how they navigate it. And one of the characters has a service dog, and it's the actress's service dog in real life. So yeah, it's really cool. And like the way they actually talk about it, like in Schitt's Creek, how they, talk about being pansexual, it's the same kind of thing in this show, where like it's not even like made into an issue. It's just part of who the characters are. And I was like, I want to see more like that. And I think that's what also influenced like, my scripts and my fiction. It was like, oh, that's okay to see like an ace character like that who has, whether they have a disability or have, some other kind of identity. And that's not really what the story is about. It's about all these other things that they're going through. So I think that's really cool to see. And I keep wanting to see it keep transferring into like other media, because we always need like more multiply marginalized characters in, you know, all media. So
Definitely.
Gosh, I mean, I think storytelling is something that transcends mediums. I think it's all storytelling, literature, painting, sculpture, playwriting, music, dance, it's all storytelling. And I think what we gain from that is just a vast array of ways to talk about queer identity and gender identity, and it's a way to build community. I think it's wonderful to see queer representation across all of these different mediums, because you will have people that love books, you have people that love TV series, you have people that love films, you have people that love Broadway, and people that love, you know, interpretive dance, like whatever you love, you know, there can be a place for you as a queer person. I think seeing that representation across all of these different mediums is only helping to build and grow our sense of community and our visibility, because I think that's really important to see us in all of these different spaces.
How has greater LGBTQ plus inclusivity impacted the writing industry?
Oh, yeah, so I think ultimately it's giving queer writers an opportunity to kind of tell our own stories. We're seeing a wider variety of representation, which ultimately means we are reaching more readers, and that is a good thing. But we are nowhere near done. We have so much further to go. Publishing, like lots of other industries, has issues with, you know, queer phobia, and we are constantly kind of bumping up against that. There is still this, I think, kind of pervasive idea that queer stories need to impart lessons. They need to be about coming out, or about struggle, or about pain. Those stories apply to us. They absolutely do, because of the world that we live in. But we know that those are not the only ways in which we as queer people exist. And so there should be stories that reflect the breadth of our humanity. I think people sometimes struggle to see our joy, you know, to see us as main characters. So it's important that we have that type of representation. I think we are seeing more inclusivity in publishing, and that means that our stories get to be about other things. We can be queer. It can be a queer normative environment within these stories. We can have stories that have queer people where the main plot isn't about your queerness. It's on the page. It's a part of who you are. But this story is about, you know, escaping a masked killer in the woods, you know, or this story is about being a dragon tamer, or this, you know, story is about being the long lost royalty. It's like we get all of these types of stories, and I think that is what is changing. We're shifting in a way that allows all of these stories to exist at the same time, not for one to replace the other, or not for one to be better than the other, just being able to have all of these stories at the same time. So I think the more representation we get, the better. The more stories we get, the better.
I think that one, there's just been, you know, a wealth of wonderful new stories that people get to read. I think also one of the wonderful things that has come out of greater representation in general, like on the author side of things, is because people are seeking out different queer stories. There's been wonderful programs like We Need Diverse Books, or like mentorship programs that have come up that specifically help foster upcoming queer authors. And so I'm like, for me, I would probably have been, I've had a lot of access barriers to authorship. And because of programs like that, I was able to learn like what publishing is like, and like share my story. So I think that that's been a really great impact, is that there's just more cool queer people, and we're like a wonderful community, and we really like each other, and like there's always somebody willing to like help pull you up the ladder. it's just a wonderful, really, really welcoming space to write in as an author on this side of things. And I think that really reflects in the stories that are being generated right now.
I think speaking to that, like there's been so much movement in like the industry, like in editors and agents. Like I feel like the industry professionals are really like working out how to support queer folks in a way that isn't necessarily the same way they would support non-queer folks. You know, because I do feel like a lot of queer authors need different accommodations, they have different values, they have a different purpose with their books. And you know, that's something that I've always really emphasized with my publishing team is like, yes, this is the way you do things for these folks, but like I know who I want to be as a queer kidlit author. I know that I want to be accessible and visible in my identity to kids and to parents, you know, to say like, here I am. But I also like, I talking to a lot of like my queer author friends, you know, their agents and their editors are very good about making sure they feel safe, you know, and making sure they aren't exhausted and making sure that, you know, if they go on tour, then they're not doing too much in the sense where they have to like validate their existence to people. So I think that's really good. I feel like I do feel like queer authors are being valued a lot more than they used to be, because like we are on the front lines right now. So yeah, like it's scary and I feel like we have a long, long way to go, but I do feel like we're being supported.
Yeah. I mean, I would hope so. I haven't started like querying yet or anything, but I would hope that, you know, that agents and editors would want to support, you know, queer authors in their journey, like no matter what other marginalizations they have, like it shouldn't matter and they should be, you know, open to the kind of support and having, you know, certain kinds of conversations. I also like, and I know there's also like a lot of gatekeeping when it comes to not just being queer, but like any marginalized identity, like with that as well. There's a lot of gatekeeping, and I'm also a sensitivity reader, so I haven't done reading for queer identity specifically. Like I haven't done it for ace identity, but I think there's also a lot of like it gets sometimes it can get like a bad rap in a way because it's like, oh, you use your sensitivity reader as a shield, and it's like that's not always I mean sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. And I just try to, you know, when I do read books that have, again, I'm sorry, I haven't done it for queer rep, but when I do read certain kinds of, you know, books with representation, I just try to give my best. You know, it's like I'm not like I am one person giving this, you know, giving this author this you know, my opinion or my, you know, the value that I see in their book to try to help them make it better. But I think that could also apply to, you know, queer rep too, that like that it's not a shield, but we are like if you have a good sensitivity reader, like we are trying to help the author make their books better. And as a writer myself, I really care about that because I care about good writing. Like I want the writing to be, you know, the best it could be, and I want the help the author, you know, make, you know, the best decisions that they can, or the best. Or I'll have some questions. We'll be like, hey, you know, do you mean this? Do you, you know, blah, blah, blah. Or if I like if I come across something that's not an identity that I share, but I think that it could be problematic, I'll flag it and I'll say, hey, can you check in with a sensitivity reader or with someone that might share this identity? And I think that's an important conversation to like have like in publishing, whether, you know, whether you're represented or not, because people shouldn't, you know, hide behind a sensitivity or an authenticity reader, but they should, you know, take into consideration, you know, all different kinds of feedback. And that does tie into the larger conversation about publishing, because sensitivity and authenticity readers are part of the publishing ecosystem as well, besides just authors and editors and stuff. Like there's that aspect to it.
I feel like that's very similar to the way that, you know, I feel like less now, but definitely in the last few years that publishers and editors have really like tried to misuse like, diverse folks, like saying, okay, you know, we're gonna get all these Black folks, we're gonna get all these queer folks, we're gonna get all these disabled folks, and just be like, yeah, so we have a diverse list, whilst not taking care of them. I think similarly with like sensitivity and authenticity readers, you know, they're so important, and it's so important to like approach those readings as, you know, this is going to make my book better, this is going to make my book safer, this, you know, this is for the good, not like, okay, well, you know, I did my due diligence and whatever. Because I've definitely seen it where authors and writers will reach out to sensitivity readers and they'll get that feedback and they'll ignore it completely, which is just, it's devastating because like, you know, you can't even pretend to be ignorant anymore because it has been stated, you know, that this is a problem and you need to go out and work on that. You need to, you know, work that out in your head. You need to find other readers. And, you know, most people just want that note of validation that, oh, yes, you did a great job. You're fine. You're not problematic. And it's just like, no, that's not the way it works. And yeah, I think the industry has a long way to go in that sense. I feel like sensitivity and authenticity readers need a lot more like money, you know, pay them, and a lot more respect, and like to be treated like editors because that's what they are. Like they exist in equal importance in the industry, and to be respected in their opinion the way that we respect editors. So yeah, more of that, please.
That's great. I love how we covered multiple aspects to what, you know, what writing and the writing industry is, and how this gets affected. That brings us to, how does including LGBTQ rep in fiction today interact with portrayals of gender norms in historical settings? So I think this is kind of calling out specifically to writing, say, historical fiction, or if you're setting something a little bit in the past.
I feel like I can speak on this. I write medieval fantasy with queer folks. The way I approach it is I want my stories to be very immersive and to be very real. I don't want someone to pick up Sir Callie and be like, haha, this isn't realistic. I cannot see myself, therefore I don't need to interact with it. It's very much a modern story in a historical setting. And, you know, I feel like a lot of, you know, queer genre fiction is very good at doing that, where it's a safe place to play, whilst also being very immersive and very personal. And, you know, sometimes you can have really difficult conversations in a safe way as far as genre goes with fantasy and with queer rep. So that's the way I approach it. I try not to worry too much about the historical accuracy of my work. Like, for example, my characters need coffee and they need potatoes, even though it's like 14th century Cornwall. So it's very much, you know, understanding that queer folks have always been here, have always existed, even if you don't know about them. And like giving queer characters a chance to just, you know, have fun, in my opinion. Give the gays the swords.
Yes.
Yes.
I went to historical by writing kind of a 1980s setting. But
Yeah. I joke
overall,
my historic
just whatever I wanted it to be anyways. So
yeah, I have my historical fiction that I have drafted is set in 2008. So like,
I will say that like I'm like, although I haven't written like proper historical fiction, I love reading it, especially like the queer stuff. I don't know why, but there's something about like the 1930s talking about queer characters that just like gets to me so hard. Some of my favorites are wow, what is it? Regeneration by Pat Barker. And it's like it's a trilogy about the World War I poets, like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. And it's just like historical fan fiction. And I love that so much. It's so good. What else? I wish I could remember. I can't remember that. Yeah, like there's something about historical queer fiction that speaks to my soul. And it's almost like validation, like again, like we're here, we're queer, we always have been. And you know, talking about Virginia Woolf, who was, you know, probably queer, and then like Louisa May Alcott, who wrote Little Women, like we think that she might have been trans. I feel like it's just breathing life into a past that has been turned very stagnant and very stationary. And almost like, you know, the people who are denying the queerness has rewritten history to their satisfaction. And it's now like, no, we're going to turn back the clock. We're going to turn it back into what it should be. We're going to say like, yes, in the 1800s, there were queer folks. It's wild. I'm rambling now, but like historical queerness, yes, please.
Yeah, so I think if we're talking about kind of gender and sexuality, kind of the intersections of those two things in fiction, when we're talking about historical fiction, I do write historical fiction, and I think that gives us kind of a glimpse into the way queer communities have existed in the past, and kind of and also shines a light on what we've had to do to survive, which includes things like conforming to societal norms, to gender norms, but you know, those are societal kind of constructs, and we sometimes get to challenge that in our work. So I think that answers the question. I think it's such a nuanced kind of subject, but when I do write historical fiction, I do find myself kind of reevaluating what it might have meant to be someone who didn't conform or didn't want to conform to gender norms, you know, in the past, and what that might have looked like for a queer community at that time.
Okay. And then this is the fun question where you get to look at your whole bookshelf. What are good examples of queer rep in spec fic?
Fic and fiction in general.
Mm-hmm.
We've covered a few. So, you know, to summarize, we already talked about Hell Followed With Us, Iron Widow. What was, you mentioned one more, Esme?
The Witch King by H.E. Edgman.
Mhm.
And then we've talked about TV a bunch.
I have one. It just came out. It's If Tomorrow Doesn't Come
Yes.
by Jen St. Pierre.
Ooh, I want to read that.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, they're a friend of mine, so I'm very biased, but it's what I'm reading right now. So but
Jen's
it's
writing is
spec
lyrical, beautiful. That's
Oh
on my
my
list too.
gosh.
Yeah.
Yeah, incredible. I read a draft of the manuscript in like 2020, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing.
So much good stuff came out of 2020.
Right.
What
But
am I
there's-
thinking?
I think I also want to go back to what Esme said earlier about like there is so much good genre, like especially in genre fiction specifically, whether it's fantasy or sci-fi or horror or something. For queer representation, there is so much of it, and I think that's really important because especially like kids, you know, kids want to escape to those different worlds. So it's really important to like have that representation in specifically the genre space, because I feel like not that there's nothing wrong with like contemporary or anything, or like a pure historical or something, but to have those elements of speculative, you know, to it, either set it in space, or you know, to have powers, or to be at a haunted house, or to be, what does it mean to explore horrors inside you, or whatever. Like, I think the genre fiction is a great way to explore, you know, any kind of queer identity, because it gives a springboard to not just the reader but for the writer.
And like I want to speak also to like metaphors, because I feel like that's such an important part of like sci-fi and fantasy. It's like magic is always a metaphor for something, and if you're looking at it from a queer perspective, then you can just like apply all of those metaphors to some kind of queerness. Like for example, all my dragons are trans, that's just canon. And like my magic is very much a metaphor for like gender identity and like the fluidity of that. And it's so fun to take these elements that, you know, have existed in fiction for such a long time and kind of remold them to tell the story that I want to, a story that will speak to queer kids who haven't been able to like have that for themselves. Like they have to choose between like the queer contemporaries where they're at school, or, you know, fantasy where they don't see kids like themselves. So having something metaphorical can almost speak more strongly to especially kids going through a tough time than contemporary can. And I love playing with that. That did not answer your question even slightly, but there we go.
I think it's interesting too, because one of the, I made a little list because that's the kind of person I am. But one of the really interesting intersections of spec fic and queer fic for me is stuff that is like on the edge of spec fic. So like Out of Character by Jenna Miller is about role playing in a fantasy pirate world, but like the main story is set very firmly in real world. And then there's this element of like using role play to explore queerness. Even If We Break by Mariaka Nijkamp has like a fantasy role playing game in this really cool, twisty queer thriller. And I think as queer folks, like as queer writers, and just like queer readers, having that playground of a fantastical world or like an unexpected element, just like using character to explore who you could be, whether that's a kid sitting down and reading a fantasy book with queer rep in it, or whether that's a book about a kid sitting down and playing a fantasy game with queer rep in it. Like that, having that lens of being able to explore identity, I think is really, really powerful and wonderful. And I'm really excited that we're starting to see books like that in like with a lot of great queer rep in it, because it's just to me such a really powerful metaphor, like wonderful, very here for that. Kind of edge of spec fic, if that counts.
No. I feel like this goes back to like what we were saying about fan fiction. Like we always see ourselves like in the margins. And I feel like genre fic is very similar in that, like, you know, it's an escapism. It's I can't deal with the real world. I don't want to deal with the real world. Like I need a space to explore who I am, like different aspects of myself. Like I can be a boy, I can be a girl, I can be a fairy, I can be a dragon, like anything. Like it's just, you know, there are no like physical laws, which is amazing. So it's definitely a playground, and I think that's why, you know, so many queer folks are so creative, because, you know, even just existing in our bodies, like it doesn't quite feel real. You know, there's such a disconnect between like our bodies and our minds, like speaking for myself. And like having that freedom just to imagine, you know, imagine a world where there's no homophobia, imagine a world where like I look different, imagine a world, blah, blah, blah. So like, yeah, I feel like genre fiction really enables that as a reader and a writer, I think.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I was also thinking about, I had written this novella and I'm not, you know, getting it published or anything, but it's adult, and one of the side characters is queer, and in my earlier drafts of this novella, and it's a, you know, it's a fantasy, so it's speculative. In one of the earlier drafts, I had killed off this character, and then I remember like going back to revise it because I kind of tried to see if I could, you know, get it, you know, published and stuff, because it's harder to publish novellas. But I remember going back and being like, did I do something accidental? Like, did I do the bury your gay? Like, oh no! Like, did I make that mistake in my own, like, even though I don't share like that specific queer identity, like, did I make that mistake? So I actually ended up making it so the character doesn't die. He gets injured, but he doesn't die. And I was just like, did I, you know, and it was in a, you know, a fantasy, so like a contemporary fantasy setting. And I was just like, did I feed into the, you know, stereotypes that we've been told like not to do? But then it's like, but I'm writing it and it's, you know, I'm kind of seeing it in a certain direction. Maybe, you know, what was my intention in writing that? So I had to go back and like really examine, like, was I feeding into the stereotype, or was I trying to say something else? But it was really interesting. But I did go back and and kind of fix that. So
Like I find that so interesting because I had a similar issue when I was drafting Callie. I was at the point where I was really trying to work out like who Callie is and like working out what non-binary means to them and like why they are who they are. And like I was realizing that I had so many like misogynistic tropes in there. It's just like Callie's just like, no, I hate girl stuff, blah blah blah. And I'm just like, ooh, I don't like this, like this is where my brain is automatically going, but like this doesn't feel right. So I really had to like sit and examine like where those ideas are coming from me, because and then I realized how much like internalized misogyny I have too. So I feel like queer and just generally marginalized authors like do have so much like self-examination and just the need to like really, look at what you're doing. Is that what I wanted to say? If it's not, how else can I say it while still like keeping, what the story is? And it's just like, okay, so I don't want it to be like that, but I also like don't want Callie to be just like, yes, everything's fine. I wanted them to have like that big question themselves. And again, like I feel like fantasy is a safe place to do that. But yeah, I feel like there's a lot of responsibility on marginalized authors in a way that feels quite unfair sometimes. And like sometimes I'll read, books by non-marginalized creators, and I'll be just like, you did not sit and examine yourself in a way that maybe you should have. And I think it's like finding the balance between, not wanting to do harm, not wanting to hurt people the way that we know that we can be hurt, but also like, still telling your truth and still telling your story. And I think that can be a really hard balance to find sometimes.
I was just looking up recent books that I read because I asked that question. I'm not on the panel, I'm just moderating, but I'm like, well, what books have I read lately? One that I was thinking of too was I just read Every Bird a Prince by Jen Reese, which is a middle grade story with Ace Rep.
Yes, I need to read that.
Oh, that one, and I think that was on, I read it because it was on, I think, Nebula's reading list or something like that. And I was trying to think of some other, I feel like I'm reading a lot of books that just have the rep, right? In it. It's not necessarily, like you said, part of this, like the point of the story, which is really nice. The characters are just there experiencing the story. And the story isn't necessarily about their queerness. I mean, although that is obviously wrapped up in their life, and that is how they experience the world. So it is kind of hard to then be like, well, what are some really good ones to call?
Oh, as soon as someone asks me like what I'm reading, I'm like, I've never read a book in my life.
Books, what are books?
Who's she?
Yes, exactly.
Story graph, real quick.
I read a lot in contemporary, so I don't have a lot of spec fic just off the cuff, but like Jen's book, If Tomorrow Never Comes, wonderful. I also had Tea Dragon Society on my list just because I think that was such a wonderful, like, it's super cozy fantasy, like queerness just exists in the world. It's beautiful, like the illustrated, like the art, oh, wonderful. And that's Kay O'Neill, and Kay has so many wonderful books, just yeah. So, but no, I feel as soon as anybody is like, what are you reading? I have never read a book in my life, to be honest with you.
I really enjoyed Cameron Battle, the first book. I haven't read the second book yet, and there is queer rep in that, like right off the bat, which is fabulous. But yeah, I ping between I want more casual rep in all things, and also just like I want fantasy where the gay is the point, and I realize that that's why I'm writing it, because I don't get to read it much. So we write what we want to read, I think.
Yeah, I definitely think that, and I also think I keep track of what I read on my phone, because I find that if I would do it for Goodreads or Storygraph, it wouldn't reflect what I read, because I do so many sensitivity and authenticity reads and beta reads, and I want to count those as part of my reading. And what I find was at the end of the year, I will put like not just like what I read and by genre, but I'll put books by, LGBTQ, books by queer authors, books by BIPOC authors, books by disabled. And I think in terms of, because I'm always seeking out diverse reads, I think that queer books always come, it's always the highest number of queer books because that incorporates, every other identity. So that's going to be like the highest, whether it's YA, middle grade, adult, whatever, that's going to be like the highest number of books that I've read. And not, obviously, not every book that I read will have queer characters or queer main characters, but I found over the last couple of years when I started keeping track that the queer characters across, different identity spectrums has been the highest number in terms of like that specific marginalized identity versus, BIPOC or disability or neurodivergence or whatever. I thought that was interesting. So.
Is anybody looking around their bookshelves? I was just thinking about conversations I've been having too. And I felt like I was late on the train for Gideon the Ninth.
Oh, I haven't read it yet.
I somehow haven't read that either.
I know people that are literally feral.
Yes.
Like feral.
Yes.
Absolutely. I might read Tumblr, like on Tumblr. That just might be my thing, is reposting Gideon the Ninth.
I love that.
So that one I feel like deserves a mention. There's a lot of different things going on in that series too. So when you talk about other rep, I think that there were things that Muir specifically also examined, besides, I think, what is it? It's often called lesbians in space, right? Sometimes. It's one of the things I've heard. So that one also is probably, it's out there, right? Everyone has heard about it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I think we would be remiss not to mention too, How to Lose the Time War.
Oh, yes. Oh my goodness.
This week.
Oh,
which won awards back in 2019, but apparently hit number 3 or something in all book sales on Amazon this week due to
Nicholas, love it. Kudos.
A Trigon fan account. Just saying, go read it. So that one probably should get mentioned too. Okay, so I do have to do a shout out for my favorite book, which is Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson.
Oh, I haven't read that.
Oh, well, that one came out in 2020, I think. I should know when it came out, right? But I read it pretty close to when it came out, and it's currently, one of my top favorite books. It's very good. All right. Do we have any more good examples?
Queer. I really like anything by Carmen Maria Machado. I love both her memoir and the short story collection. I mean, that really impressed me. I was blown away by both books. I read her memoir, I think, last year, and then I read the short story collection in 2019, and I still remember like just the impact of it. Was just really cool to read like a queer book that was so unapologetic in genre, but it went to so many different like spec fic genres. Like it stretched in so many different like ways. Like it wasn't confined to like one spec fic genre. I really liked that.
One of my absolute favorites is All That's Left in the World. It's by Eric Brown, and it came out last year. And I call it Heartstopper in the Apocalypse. And it's so good. And it's exactly what I love, like the mix of like, this is genre fiction, this is what we understand genre fiction to be, but also like, it's about the gays. And it's about 2 queer boys who are basically left on their own during the apocalypse, and they're trying to find like humanity in society. And it's so good, and it's devastating, and it's so relatable and beautiful, and it made me cry several times, which is what I always call a success. And I don't have the dust jacket on it because I think the spine is really pretty.
Oh, wow. So yeah, there's a lot. I would say speculative fiction. I would say An Unkindness of Ghosts by Rivers Solomon. The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. Maybe also like an anthology type, well, not an anthology, but like a short story collection type thing. Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado is fabulous, amazing speculative
I
fiction.
think that one got brought up in the group setting too.
Yes, that
Yeah.
one is one of my faves. So yeah, those are some of my favorites.
All right, well, that's great that we can add to people's reading lists if they haven't already read those books. Those all sound wonderful. And then I have just a couple more questions. The last one that's sort of on topic is, what do you hope to see with the future of queer rep in fiction?
I would love to see just more stories, more representations of folks within the LGBTQIA+ community. And I'd like to see it across all genres and all age categories. I would like to see just more inclusive queer stories across age categories, especially for really young readers, because I feel like they're really searching for that. They're really looking for those types of stories in chapter books and early readers and things like that. I would really just like to see queer books getting the same hype that other books get. I would like to see people get as excited about our stories as they do about other kind of non-queer stories. And I'd like to see publishing, put more of their muscle behind our stories. I think that's important to show that we have their support and that they support us as creators.
More dragons, more swords, more magic, please.
One thing I would really love to see is more fat rep in queer rep too. I think there's like a lot of sometimes like queerness is typed as looking a certain way, and so I think like just blowing that open with like you can be non-binary and fat, and like you can have like you can be everything in fat. Would love to see that. Would just love to see more intersectional queer rep in general, and then just for fun, queer vampires. Bring it on. More queer vampires, please.
I feel like vampires are just automatically queer, but then I can't think of any queer vampires.
There's a couple of like there's like a little bit of I shouldn't get started. I have a not so secret love for vampire fiction. But there's some cool stuff going on, but I just like more gay vampires, please. Like just like on the page, very gay, indisputably queer vampires.
Tell us, that was the last question. Tell us.
Tell about the
Well, you said you have some.
so yeah, like there's one of the ones that I really enjoy is there is a, oh gosh, I'd have to look at my bookshelf. There's a anthology of short fiction called Vampires Never Get Old. Yeah, and that's where the First Blood show launched out of, but there's cool stuff going on there. Yeah, but just like more of that, like just standalone wonderful queer vampires, please bring it on.
Have you read The Last Hope in Hopetown?
That is on my TBR. It looks so, yes.
Good.
Oh,
Maria
okay.
is such a good writer, and it's
bumping that up.
Yes, and the adoptive moms in that are lesbian vampires, and it's
okay, sold. I'm gonna pick that up from the library like tomorrow.
Lara, do you have anything to add?
Well, this is typical answer for me. More disability rep, please. There's not a ton of wheelchair using characters, especially wheelchair users with other disabilities, which is what I'm always writing. Is like there's always just like the character has one disability, and that's like not enough because people have multiple visible and physical disabilities. So I would like to see more characters with like physical disabilities and neurodivergencies, you know, across different ethnicities and different cultures and different religions and things like that. I think that that would be really I'm I'm gonna always like say that, especially like in like queer like with queer identities. I would love to see more different types of disability rep, because also just like with queer identities, you're even if someone writes like somebody's their identity, like everyone has a different experience of what their identity is, so you're not going to get like the exact experience of a person's queer identity or their queer disabled identity, or if they're a queer, you know, person of color or whatever. Like you're not going to get like you're just one person. So, you know, a few different people telling a story, and even if they have the same types of background, you're gonna get different stories. So even if they have the same, you know, identities or whatever, like you're still gonna get, I don't know, I just want to see more, definitely more different kinds of ACE rep, because I'm in an ACE anthology. I feel like it kind of gets, you know, brushed off because people still don't think that like there is, like they don't consider ACE a part of the queer spectrum. And there's so many different like nuances. So I would like to see that as well. And in different like genres and categories, like not just spec fic, but like, you know, other kinds of genres.
Great, great. Well, I think we are just about at time. So what I would like to do is have each of you please share where to find you and a book or project that of yours that you would like to talk about for just a brief minute.
So I am on most social media platforms, so Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, with the same handle at Kalynn Bayron. And then my next book is a YA horror novel called You're Not Supposed to Die Tonight. It is out June 20th. It is my ode to 80s slasher films, which I love. And it is it was a really fun book to write, and I can't wait to see it out this summer. It comes out June 20th.
I'm Esme Symes-Smith. You can find me on Twitter most of the time at Esme Symes-Smith. If you like queer middle grade fiction, you should read my book, Sir Callie. It's about a non-binary kid who wants to be a knight, and they take down the patriarchy as they go, and they find friends, and we only have one straight person in it, and he's the bad guy. So we're good there. And also pre-order book 2. That's Willow in a Dress. We love it.
I'm Christen Randall. You can find me on most social medias at @bycrandall, and on my very terrible website, bychristenrandall.com. My book, The No Girlfriend Rule, debuts in spring of 2024. It is a wonderful, silly, joyous, fun, queer coming of age story about a anxious fat girl who wants to play a D&D style tabletop role-playing game to prove that she's worth keeping around for her boyfriend, and accidentally finds herself, her people, and maybe a cute girlfriend along the way.
You could find me, my Twitter and Instagram is at True Cherry Girl. It's TRU Cherry Girl. And I do keep it locked, but if people want to follow, I will follow back, especially if it's like other writers or readers. I just keep it locked for other reasons because I don't like to get spammed. I don't have a website, but if you Google my name, or if you Google Lara Ameen writer, you can find like different short stories that I've published. There's a novel excerpt that I have published through a grant, a YA novel, and different things that you'll be able to find if you Google. And then I have a short story in the Being Ace anthology that comes out in October 10th, 2023. We're supposed to get our arcs, but I don't have mine yet. I would hold it up, but I don't have mine yet. But My Story is a short story. It's a YA thriller about an ace girl with cerebral palsy who uses a wheelchair, and she has to save her girlfriend. She has 48 hours to save her girlfriend from an anonymous enemy.
Need it.
Yeah, that sounds like so much fun.
All right, and I'm Adria Belton. You can find me at my website. I am going to actually promote one thing. I didn't do this with other panels, but since it's a queer rep in SpecFic, I have a Cinderella retelling coming up in Z&B Presents Year One. The anthology comes out July 1st, and it's available pre-order at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. And which Cinderella is queer. What to say that?
Yes.
Yay!
More of that.
And so I hope that our viewers and attendees will come join us in the Discord. You're welcome to ask us questions, and these wonderful panelists will be there to answer. Thank you so much for your time.
Having me.
I will.